This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Hello, this is Simon from Film Stories. I'm delighted to tell you that this podcast is brought to you in association with Prop Store. Our friends at Prop Store are putting on a new entertainment memorabilia live auction, which is kicking off on March the 25th, 2026. You can view the catalogue and start bidding now. Some choice lots that I've found. Right, don't bid against me for any of these. So, 1989's Batman, there is a full size of the Gotham City Cathedral Bell is going up for auction. Staying on the Batman theme, meanwhile, I mean, the mightiest of all Batman films is clearly 1997's Batman and Robin. Right, Arnold Schwarzenegger as Mr. Freeze, his light-up freeze gun is also going up for auction. And then if you want something particularly niche, any fans out there of 1995's Crimson Tide from the late, great Tony Scott? Yep. You can have the launch key with a pair of nuclear launch codes. That prop from the film is included in the auction. It's a 4-day auction. You can bid on it online. You just need to get yourself to www.propstoreauction.com and sign up there, and there's lots across film, TV and animation just waiting for you. The golden rule of all of this, the biggest rule of all, when you're at propstoreauction.com, don't bid against me.
Welcome to Japan on Film podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and today we're going to be talking about the 1960 film The Blind Menace, the original Japanese title of which is Shiranui Kengyo. And here to talk about this movie with me is new guest Jonathan Wroot. Jonathan, how are you doing today?
Yes, I'm doing good. Thank you, Perry. All things considered, we were just talking briefly before we got the recording started. I think you've mentioned before you record in Japan. I'm in the UK, so it's early morning here, but despite that, yes, I think I've had enough tea. So happy to be talking about Japanese films.
Well, I always appreciate UK guys coming in at the weird schedule because Japan and the US, sometimes the time zones are semi-compatible. Like usually it's morning here, it's night over there, but it's a decent time. But with the UK, it's a little bit more difficult to find a good time to arrange these schedules. So I always appreciate when you guys are able to come in early or stay up late, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, definitely a case of coming in early. But as I said, happy to do that today.
Awesome. Well, before we get too much into the movie today, why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm senior lecturer in film studies at the University of Greenwich. I write and research about Japanese films. I've done that a lot in the past. I must say I haven't done so much of that recently, but people can easily find out about my publications online, which I'll come to in a moment. I'll just say I've been at the University of Greenwich for it's coming up to 8 years now. At the University of Greenwich, I did some teaching at Worcester and Birmingham. Before that, did my postgraduate studies at the University of East Anglia before going into teaching. So yeah, along the way, I've written a lot about Japanese cinema, home media formats, and also horror cinema. I've written research on. Got a couple of ongoing projects at the moment, which I maybe won't go into too much more detail now, but might plug some stuff at the end of the podcast recording. So I'll give a quick summary there. So yeah, written a lot about Japanese cinema, which does include, of course, and this does relate to our choice of film today, it does include the only that I could find. There's been a few other kind of smaller books on the Zatoichi films, which summarize the films in terms of plot. But I published in 2021 The Paths of Zatoichi, which is a monograph encompassing the history of the Japanese Zatoichi films and also the impact that they had around the world. And today's film that we're talking about is actually a film that Shintaro Katsu stars in, that he did a couple of years before the first Zatoichi film. I'll just quickly mention as well, but I'll give more details about this again at the end of the podcast. I've been very lucky earlier this year to all of a sudden be asked to write a lot of booklet essays for upcoming Blu-ray releases of Japanese films, and even recorded some audio commentaries for Japanese films earlier this year. And I'll let you know again at the end of the podcast. I'll do the plugging and promoting thing that I know Perry likes to ask at the end of the podcast, because I should be able to tell you then roughly the exact dates those Blu-ray releases will be coming out if listeners are interested.
Okay, very cool. Yeah, and so we have had another Zatoichi author on the show before, Frank Schildener,
Yes.
although I don't know
Yeah.
if his book has actually managed to come out yet or not. But we've been talking through email a few times over since you discovered the show, and I think you guys have actually been in contact as well. I think I passed on a copy of the book to him.
Oh, right. It's brilliant that you passed on a copy. I don't remember if I missed that in one of your emails. I apologize. I don't believe I received Frank's email address. I'd love to chat to him because his book that you were telling me about was in various stages of possibly being published, then not. Does sound fascinating. And yeah, it'd be great to chat to him. And if you shared a copy of my book with him, then great. I'm sure he's got a lot to add, because I do remember listening to yours and Frank's episode on Zatoichi. I think it was just the Takeshi Kitano film you talked
That's
about.
right,
Is
yeah.
that right? Yeah, that was a really fascinating listen. I know you went into a lot of the history of the character there. There's so much more to be discussed, which I'm sure Frank is aware of. I won't try and sidetrack this episode and turn it into a Zatoichi episode today. Maybe we can save that for a future one if you'll have me back, Perry. You said you had the Zatoichi films on DVD. Maybe we can discuss a future one in another episode. I will also mention as well, again, they were out earlier this year. The first Blu-ray essay that I wrote for a release of a Japanese film was for 88 films, and it was for Zebra Man 2, a Takashi Miike film. And I've got, I'm sure you've got copies of them as well. I know they're on your film list. So I've got Zebra Man 1 and 2 on Blu-ray. And as I said, I think I've pretty much listened to every episode of the podcast now. I know you're a big Miike fan. No, those I think are really interesting films. Maybe not Miike's best, but there's lots to discuss there in those films. So I'd be happy to come on and speak about those in future as well as, of course, my favorite topic, Zatoichi. And I will just plug, I know listeners can't see this at the moment, and I know you've already covered this film. I'm a big fan also of Battle Royale, as my t-shirt shows.
Oh yes, love that
Yeah,
myself.
but I know you've already covered that on the podcast, so I can't find an excuse to, maybe I don't think, to get you to talk about that one again.
Well, you may actually have a chance, because that Battle Royale was part of the first 2 seasons or so of the episodes when I was just doing them solo, and it was just kind of like my own thoughts and ideas about it. So it wasn't really a discussion type thing. And so Battle Royale is one of those movies that I think might be worth revisiting in a discussion episode, but that's something I gotta ruminate on a little bit more. But if people do want to hear more Battle Royale talk, I mean, I'm always happy to discuss it. Zebra Man, actually, I have covered that, but not on this show. I've actually covered it on my other show, which is Superhero Cinephiles, which is all about superhero movies. So I talked about it on that show over. So if anyone's interested, you can go to superherocinephiles.com. You can look for Zebra Man in the search there, and you'll be able to, and it'll pop right up. Although that was with someone who was not really a big fan of Japanese cinema. He doesn't really know a whole lot about it. So I think we could definitely dive into some more of the cultural elements if or when we do get to it on this show. So that's something we can put a pin in for later.
Brilliant. Yeah, sounds great.
Okay, but before we dive too much into the movie, so you talked a lot about your background here and all this kind of stuff. As regards your teaching, and so are you teaching classes? What sort of classes are you teaching related to Japanese cinema? Is it more kind of like general Japanese cinema courses, or is it like one of my first introduction to Japanese cinema actually came through a world cinema class where there was that was where I first saw Rashomon for the first time, but it was cinema from all non-American countries in general. And but I do know also, a guest we've had frequently on here, Lindsay Nelson. She teaches classes. She's taught classes in like specifically about like Japanese horror or things of that nature. But what about you? What are some of the classes that you're doing that are specifically related to Japanese cinema, if at all?
Yeah, I do teach some classes on Japanese cinema. How university degrees work here in the UK, I don't think there's too much dissimilarity, perhaps, with how it is taught in the USA, as far as I'm aware. It might be a little bit different in Japan. I'm not entirely sure there. But we have two main teaching terms here at the University of Greenwich. There is a third teaching term in the academic year that's usually given over to exams and handing in coursework. So in those two main teaching terms, we now teach a different set of modules each term. So that's like 10 or 12 teaching weeks. And a lot of the modules I teach at the University of Greenwich, I teach a lot of first year classes, which are introductions to film history. I actually put a lesson about Battle Royale actually in one of my first year modules called Screen Contexts, where I'm also introducing to students to filmmaking trends and themes around the world and different ways of studying film. So it sounds a bit egotistical to say this now. I put that class in on Battle Royale because I've written about Battle Royale in the past in a reference book, a textbook, academic textbook, all about home media formats. And in the UK, as well as other countries around the world, Battle Royale is one of those films that's been re-released a lot. It's one of those titles that always sells. So that's why I studied that in that chapter, and we have a look at that research in that film class. I do teach a world cinema class as well, and for our second year students. So yeah, the ethos of that module is as I've mentioned, is world cinema. So I can't just teach a class on teach 10 or 12 weeks on Japanese cinema. I'd love to, but every time I've put out feelers for that at the University of Greenwich, unfortunately, there hasn't been that much uptake for that. Sometimes we do get overlapping interest from other degrees with some of the subjects that I teach on, because sometimes I touch on the subjects of anime and animation in the world cinema classes or other classes that I teach. And we also have an animation degree at the University of Greenwich. So many of those students are inspired and are really big fans of anime. So yeah, the world cinema classes, I had to reduce them because we changed the structure of how we teach the modules. I used to spend at least 2 weeks on Japanese cinema, but now it's reduced down to 1 week. But when we had the longer iteration of the module, I would try to divide up the two lessons into like older Japanese history and more recent Japanese film history. The more recent Japanese film titles actually changed a lot in the last few years. I'll mention those titles in a minute, but it was always Yojimbo that I'd pick as the older Japanese film. That's one of my favorite Kurosawa films. The temptation was always to ask the students to watch before the class because timetable's kind of limited. We never had time to show the students in a film in a class and then discuss it immediately afterwards. So we asked the students to watch it in advance. So it's tempting to ask them to watch something like Seven Samurai, but it's 3 hours long. So I always think, well, if they're coming to Japanese cinema for the first time, maybe something shorter like Yojimbo, which is always fun to talk about. The more recent Japanese film class for a few years was the Death Note live action adaptation film. Film I've always quite enjoyed. I actually researched those films quite a bit for my MA studies.
Yeah,
And
we covered that first one a few years
yeah,
back now.
yeah. I kind of really enjoy it. That and the second one. There's a third one called Death Note L Change the World, which isn't great in my opinion. But those first two, I mean, considering they're limited to two feature films, I think they do a good job adapting as much of the story as they can. So yeah, I find those films really interesting and get students to think about, look, this is a live action Japanese film that adapts a manga. What's the difference here between, the more popular comic book film adaptations that they're more familiar with Marvel? Obviously, there's lots of differences, but you could argue similarities in terms of production context and that. In more recent years, in terms of contemporary Japanese films, I've been pointing students towards some low budget independent feature films that I've been made aware of through the distribution label Third Window Films, who primarily release films into the UK, but I know they've got a small international following as well. Some people do buy up their titles from overseas, especially into European countries, but also in America. So they've focused on one filmmaker, Junta Yamaguchi. I'm pretty sure I've got that name right. And well, he's only made two feature films, and Third Window's released both of them. They're both really interesting riffs on like time travel comedies or time loop comedies. One is Beyond the Infinite 2 Minutes. His second film is called River. They're really good films. You hear that they're about 2 minute time loops, and you're like, how can you make a feature film out of that? And then you watch the films, and you're surprised at how engrossing and engaging the story is, and what they're able to achieve on such a low budget. Really lucky here in the UK in that they were both broadcast on a UK TV channel called Film 4. So that means we can use a service at the university called Box of Broadcast that records a lot of UK TV, not all of it. But I can tell the students, right, there's that recording there that you can access through the library. Watch that before coming to class, and it's always great to hear their thoughts on it. And then just quickly as well, I do teach some third year classes, mainly one called Cinema and Space, where the discussions are often based about individual films. And again, the ethos of that module is quite broad in terms of how space is represented on screen. Sometimes we talk about science fiction films, sometimes we talk about how settings are used. I'll maybe try and change this in future, see if I can shoehorn in more of my favorite Japanese films. But at the moment, what I find with topics that the students like to talk about and what fits well with that module is usually the anime film Pompoko, which talks about the rural and urban divide in Japan. So yeah, those are the sorts of classes I teach. They haven't yet asked me to teach a whole module on Japanese films, but maybe the tide will turn on that in future, and I'll be allowed. But it's always fun to research it outside of my teaching, and sometimes bringing my research into the classes. Or one exercise I like to run in my classes on Japanese films is I like to get the students to research some Japanese film titles that they haven't maybe heard of, and then find out that they've in later years been remade in like Hollywood or other countries, or vice versa, because I hand round a printout of the poster to the Rutger Hauer film Blind Fury to some students. Then they have to Google it, and I'm like, why is he telling me to look up this film? Why does this relate to Japanese cinema? And then they realize that this is the only English language remake of a Zatoichi film that's ever been done by a Hollywood studio. The character has been homaged and referenced in other films and media. You might be aware of this, Perry, through superhero cinephiles, that there's many nods in many adaptations of Daredevil to The Blind Swordsman. Because they're
Oh yeah,
both
Frank Miller. Frank Miller made no secret about his love of Japanese
yeah,
of Japanese
yeah.
culture and cinema and that.
Yeah, exactly. So there's that, and there's also the recent Star Wars film Rogue One, where Donnie Yen doesn't just do that there, but also in John Wick Chapter 4, he's very much playing a variation on the blind cinema character. But to date, it's only Rutger Hauer who's been in a direct remake in terms of an adaptation of a Zatoichi film with Blind Fury in 1989. So through little exercises like that, I do insert as much Japanese film trivia as I can into my classes.
Okay, very cool. Very interesting stuff. Just out of curiosity, what is, because you said you're teaching like freshman students, first year students. So what is their reaction when you show them Battle Royale? Because I have in my one of the schools I teach at, I give them it's just a general, it started off as a Japanese film class, but they're all Japanese students. They wanted to see more Western films anyway. So it kind
Mm.
of morphed into just kind of like a general film class. And what I started doing is I give them a survey at the beginning of the year to see what kind of movies they want to watch. And for a while, I was forcing Battle Royale onto the syllabus, and in but we got some students saying like, oh, I don't really like it. It's too violent. And so
Mm.
this was like this past year was actually the first time I've taught it in a few years. So students actually decided they wanted to see it, and still very, very mixed reactions on it, at least from Japanese students. How about students in the UK? How do they react to Battle Royale?
Yeah, still sometimes get that mixed reception. Some students who might have talked to me at an open day, and sometimes I get asked questions about my research background and interest in Japanese cinema and horror cinema. Some students like to hear that, and that might be one reason they come onto the degree, is that I'm talking about films like Battle Royale right from year one. Because they might have already seen Battle Royale, they might be familiar with other Japanese films or Japanese anime. Um, They might really like horror films. So, my own research background might be a deciding factor in terms of whether they enroll. So those sorts of students, it might not be a huge number of them, are really happy to passionately talk about Battle Royale, whether they've seen it for the first time or maybe are already familiar with it. Um, and I can get a mixed reaction from other students. Other students who might be familiar with horror films or maybe not seen this film before might be really taken with it. My other passion that I keep mentioning, horror cinema, because I've been involved in a few publications about horror cinema in particular, usually via a Japanese case study. Um, Not all of my students are really big horror fans, so I haven't yet been able to make a module all about horror cinema, which is a shame. One of my first teaching jobs that I got was at the University of Worcester, which is in the West Midlands, in the UK, not far from Birmingham. So that's where I get a lot of my teaching experience, Worcester and Birmingham. Worcester, I was really lucky. One of the people that was already teaching there, and I came in and covered a few of their modules, already taught a lot of classes on horror cinema and kind of cult cinema and cinema about folklore and how that's been represented on screen. So that was really fun getting that experience from a first teaching experience. But when you come to a university like Greenwich, you get students from all sorts of different backgrounds, have different tastes. Not all of them are into horror, so there's not as much appetite for an entire module on horror cinema. But again, I try and insert little examples when I can. So Battle Royale is one of those titles that I try it with. Some students are outright honest with me and say they didn't get on with it. They weren't prepared for such a violent film, even though I give them all the information in advance. I'm like, look, there's the film title. This is where you can find it on Brox's Broadcast. Read the synopsis. And I do try to give them a little bit of warning saying, yep, this is rated 18. It was controversial at the time when it came out. Some people still find it controversial now. Do some reading around it. If you can't watch the whole thing, I'd be interested to know where you stopped watching. And some students are happy to engage on that basis. Some students are like, no, don't want to go there. So it can be a mixed reaction every year. But one of the reasons I bring it into that module is more to talk about my research related to it, where I'm using an approach called reception studies, where I'm getting students to ask or ask the students, how useful is it to look at reviews and the critical reception when a film came out, and also the other incarnations of what is often called in the film industry and also film studies, like the long tail of a film, its life after its theatrical release, which is significant to look at in Battle Royale with all the different DVD and Blu-ray releases. Yeah, we study that as well as the film itself. As much as the students will want to talk about the film, we see how it goes that particular year, how much they want to talk about it. But then I'm also talking about, well, how did I research this, and how much do you want to critique that? I do get quite honest with them in classes. Don't I ask them to consider the fact that you should ignore that I've written the reading you had to do this week. That's my research. Let's be critical of it, because it's sometimes useful for me to do as an academic. Go back and be critical of work I wrote a few years ago.
Okay, that's very cool. Yeah, it's always interesting because I was never really into horror films until I took a horror film class in university, just because it was one of the electives I had available, and I said, well, this. And at my university at the time, they didn't have a whole lot of variety in film classes, and so I tried to take as many of them as I could. Of course, now since I've graduated, they have their own like film analysis
Yeah.
focus on there, and they have stuff like superhero films and comic book studies and
Mm,
all stuff I would have loved to study back when I was in university. But of course, it's after I graduate that they introduce all that stuff. But that class really opened my eyes and really gave me a new appreciation for horror. And it's one of those things that I love to try and talk about. I love to try and show to my students, but I guess students in the UK and in Japan are very similar in that respect, where they're just like, I don't want to watch horror. I don't like horror. I don't care about horror. And I'm like, but
mm.
there's so much good stuff here. Come on. But all right.
No, some students really do. We were kind of unlucky in the last academic year just gone. We had a very small class that ended up being in our third year. So my cinema and space classes were really, really small. But I slowly found out after the first couple of weeks, the few students that I had, and those that were regularly coming, all women as well, female students, and they all loved discussing horror films. So that last year just gone was like the peak year for me for talking about horror cinema, and it was great every week. We just end up, I hadn't asked them to watch a horror film every week, but eventually the conversation would turn to like parallel themes that we were discussing also found in horror films. So that was fun. Maybe that will happen again for me in future. We'll see.
We'll be right back after this.
Eczema is unpredictable, but you can flare less with Ebglyss, a once-monthly treatment for moderate to severe eczema. After an initial 4-month or longer dosing phase, about 4 in 10 people taking Ebglyss achieved itch relief and clear or almost clear skin at 16 weeks. And most of those people maintain skin that's still more clear at 1 year with monthly dosing.
Ebglyss, lebrikizumab LBKZ, a 250 milligram per 2 milliliter injection, is a prescription medicine used to treat adults and children 12 years of age and older who weigh at least 88 pounds or 40 kilograms with moderate to severe eczema, also called atopic dermatitis, that is not well controlled with prescription therapies used on the skin or topicals, or who cannot use topical therapies. Ebglyss can be used with or without topical corticosteroids. Don't use if you're allergic to Ebglyss. Allergic reactions can occur that can be severe. Eye problems can occur. Tell your doctor if you have new or worsening eye problems. You should not receive a live vaccine when treated with Ebglyss. Before starting Ebglyss, tell your doctor if you have a parasitic infection.
Ask your doctor about Ebglyss and visit ebglyss.lilly.com or call 1-800-LILY-RX or 1-800-545-5979.
K-pop Demon Hunters Haja Boys breakfast meal and Huntrix meal have just dropped at McDonald's. They're calling this a battle for the fans. What do you say to that, Rumi?
It's not a battle. So glad the Saja boys could take breakfast and give our meal the rest of the day.
It is an honor to share.
No, it's our honor.
It is a larger honor.
No, really. Stop.
You can really feel the respect in this battle. Pick a meal to pick a side.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
At participating McDonald's while supplies last.
So you've talked a lot about your educational background, some of the kind of stuff you're doing right now, some of the different topics involved in Japanese cinema that you've researched, some of the different teaching you're doing. But what was the start? What was it that got you interested in Japanese cinema in the first place?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Again, thanks for your messages ahead of the podcast. I know you asked me, you may be aware this question was coming. I've been thinking back on, I'm trying to think back which was first. I think it came before I was a student. I was an undergraduate student here in the UK when I started on the journey of doing film studies. In fact, I couldn't make up my mind at the time. My undergraduate degree was joint with film studies joint with history. And that was back in 2004. But I think before that, on British TV, just after the launch of the Tartan Asia Extreme boom, which I don't know if you've heard of that DVD.
Oh label, yes, I have many Tartan Asian Extreme movies. One of the things I used to do back in university was make frequent pilgrimages to Best Buy, which was our big electronics store in the US. And anytime there was a Tartan Asian Extreme, I almost always picked it up.
Yeah. I didn't maybe pick up as many titles as I should have back in the day, and it's one of the things I regret now that I haven't got a full collection there. But when it got to my PhD studies, I became really passionate about Third Window films, and I've maintained their collection since. They've sometimes reissued on Blu-ray some of the old Tartan titles, and so is Arrow in the UK. So anyway, going back to Tartan, of course, they launched in the UK with the success of Battle Royale, Ring as well, and Audition. I think those were the 3 initial popular titles. I can't remember exactly when I came to Audition, but I'm pretty sure in both the cases of Ring and Battle Royale, they were shown late at night on Channel 4 here in the UK. Something which, well, no, they still do now. Now they've got the film spin-off channel, which is Film 4, and sometimes they still show a lot of horror films late at night, sometimes some Japanese films too, which I briefly mentioned earlier. But when I taped them, back when I had a VHS recorder off the TV back then to watch the next day, they would often come with an introduction from a film critic who still records podcasts and puts out film reviews to this day, Mark Kermode. He recorded some introductions to those films then. So that was kind of an introduction to me then to Japanese films in particular. I think before that, in my teenage and pre-teen earlier years, I probably came across things like Pokemon and Digimon on TV. But Japanese cinema really came with Ring and Battle Royale. I think it was then a few years later, just a year or so before I did go to university, I was working part-time at a sweet store of all things in the UK and the town I was living in at the time, and someone also lent me a DVD of Akira, which was mind-blowing the first time I saw it, and I find it mind-blowing every time I watch it since. There's so many different interpretations and things you can take from that film every time you watch it. And then that was kind of like soft introductions to. Oh, I've almost forgot one thing as well. Again, a couple of years before I went to university, a friend actually brought round to a party we were having with a group of friends at the time, and suggested for part of this party we watch a film that he'd just been introduced to, and he put this film on the TV, and it was Princess Mononoke, the Studio Ghibli film. So that ended up being the first Ghibli film that I saw, and over the years, while I was studying and long afterwards as well, I slowly caught up with the whole Ghibli catalogue. So that's something I've also become familiar with over the years. But yeah, this really became cemented, I think, for me when I started at university, just by chance. Because there was one day when I was exploring the resources that the university had at the time, and I know definitely at the University of Greenwich and probably at the University of Winchester and other universities now, there's probably less of this. But at that time in 2004, possibly in 2005, the University of Winchester had a lot of DVDs on its shelves. And I found by chance, which I found really an interesting coincidence afterwards, because there was no specialist Japanese film scholar at the time at the University of Winchester. I found by chance a Takeshi Kitano film on the DVD shelves, Violent Cop, his first film. Watched that. Was totally hooked. I thought this was great. It was, I think it was the old, I can't remember if it was Media Blasters or another DVD label. It might have been one called Tokyo Bullet DVD box, which was really trying to sell hard, like this is the Japanese equivalent of Dirty Harry, which it is to a certain extent, that film, but there's also a lot more going on there. Really interesting as Takeshi Kitano's first feature film. That really got me hooked to exploring more of his work, and I ended up writing my undergraduate dissertation in 2007 on Takeshi Kitano. Kind of annoying, the date that I handed that in, a eminent film scholar in the USA who I have nothing but high praise for because he endorsed my Zatoichi book, but Aaron Giraud, his book on Takeshi Kitano's filmography up to that point came out the day I handed my dissertation in, so I couldn't reference it. So that was a cruel coincidence. But I still loved writing that dissertation. I've been hooked on Takeshi Kitano's films since. And I had to like self-teach myself on the subject of Japanese cinema, because as I said, there wasn't any Japanese film scholars there at the university at that time. A couple of tutors asked me, is this really what you want to do? We don't really have a specialist supervisor for you, but I was committed by that point and kind of been hooked on it ever since, as my career shows.
Yeah, that's something I've always wanted to do myself, because I've also been in areas where there wasn't any Japanese film scholar or anything like that, and my degree was just a basic English degree. It wasn't a film specialty degree. Same with my master's. It was just they didn't have like a film analysis or film study program or anything like that where I did my online master's. So it's one of those things I've wanted to do, but most of my, and now I don't even have access to academic journals and all that. So most of the stuff that I've done, it's all been like self-taught. The stuff I bring to the show and all that, it's just based on my own experiences, my own knowledge of Japanese society, Japanese history, and just kind of like trying to wing it as best I can, basically.
Yeah, it's still the case. I mean, I found this a few years ago when I published my Zatoichi book. Academic publishers, as you probably know by looking into maybe some of these publications, Perry, they're not cheap to pick up these books. And when
no, not at all.
No, I found this unfortunately with my Zatoichi book. This is why maybe I shouldn't say this on a podcast, but if anyone contacts me and is interested about my Zatoichi research, I will happily email material to them, because the publisher did put it out as being very expensive. The publisher at the time was Rowman and Littlefield. That's recently been bought up by Bloomsbury. I don't know if in future that means maybe my book will be put out in a cheaper paperback format. I'll have to wait and see about that. Yeah, unfortunately, the agreement of a publisher putting it out there meant they put an extortionate price on it, sadly. But I'm always happy for people to email me and discuss Zatoichi films and Japanese films with them. Where I would say that's one interesting change I have noticed recently, there's very slow changes with like open access publications, which are public and free to read, and I believe more universities should go in that direction. And it's still kind of an expensive hobby, but an interesting thing I've also noticed, if you're really into Japanese films and you collect a lot of DVDs and Blu-rays, a lot of the special edition Blu-rays that are coming out now, they're always trying to add more books to them, more video essays, more interviews with filmmakers. So they are becoming kind of like a little film school of themselves, especially in topics like Japanese cinema.
Yeah, I remember that too with some of the older DVDs when I was picking up at the time, especially like the Seven Samurai DVD. They had some pretty interesting like scholarship involved in that with the Criterion collection. But anyway, let's start talking about the Blind Menace. So this is again
Sure.
1960 film, and as you'd mentioned, it stars Shintaro Katsu, who's famously known for Zatoichi, although this came out before that. And to show you, and like everything I've looked up about this movie, every single review I've seen about it, everybody references the fact that, oh, this is the guy who played Zatoichi, but here he's playing like the anti-Zatoichi. So much so that the description on Letterboxd reads, "This is the story of a blind masseur who tricks people, steals, and kills. He is the anti-Zatoichi." So even in Letterboxd, the semi-official description, like the most official description you're going to get, references the fact that this actor has played Zatoichi. So I had never heard of this movie before, and the Zatoichi stuff, the only one I've really seen is the Kitano film. So I'm not even that familiar with Katsu. So this is kind of my first introduction to him. So I didn't even go into it with the kind of idea of, okay, I'm going to see the guy who's famous for Zatoichi playing the exact opposite of that kind of character, right? Almost as if you're thinking like you're going to see, I don't know, Harrison Ford playing like the exact opposite of Indiana Jones or something like that. Like
Well, you
that
could
kind of
argue
thing.
he did that in What Lies Beneath, maybe. That's
Yeah,
one of the few
I guess you
times he
could. I
did
guess
that,
you could.
yeah.
Although in the Raiders of the Lost Ark, there's some creepy backstory there with him.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, but we don't have to get into that now. But one of the things that came out to me when I was looking at it is the title. So the English title is The Blind Menace, but the Japanese title, like I mentioned, it's Shiranui Kengyo. Now, my Japanese is not that great, but I tried running this through translations, and Kengyo I know is the name of it's like the status, right? The blind masseur, like the high status blind masseur. But Shiranui, what I got from that was it came up with phosphorescent light or mysterious light on the sea. So I'm not sure. Am I missing something in this usage of the term that you know of?
I'm again, my knowledge is kind of limited to the film's release and the later DVD release of this film. It's a really interesting film in many ways because, again, I kind of regret choosing it now because I know you're not that familiar with the older Zatoichi films, Perry. And you mentioned on a subsequent email, oh, I have them all, and maybe we should watch some of them. Maybe we'll come back to that in future. But I still think this is a really interesting film to highlight because lots of people think Shintaro Katsu and think of the honorable blind swordsman Zatoichi, but this is such a different film and really interesting in a lot of ways. And one of the interesting things about its release is if anyone is interested in this film, you can find copies of it online to watch now, which might be the best way to go about it because the last DVD release I've came across is out of print and it was from Animego in 2010. However, if you do put in the Blind Menace Animego into Google, you will find the Animego website, and what they've got there is the DVD liner notes from this release that I have, which is quite expensive to find now, about secondhand. You can find images of the DVD cover on eBay, and usually with postings of it being sold for about $40. I think was the most recent one I saw. So it's quite expensive to get a hold of because it's now a print disc, but it's really helpful on this Animego website. They've got the liner notes there because there are a few lines that pertain to your question, Perry, as best as I can answer it. So I'm kind of going from this information. What I don't know is where they've got this information from. They do acknowledge the fact that in the film, the use of the term Shiranui is not really explained. There's an assumption made it could just be the family name of Suginoichi's master, and Kengyo is his rank. Ranks of blind people, especially within the medieval Todoza system, are really interesting because that's where we get the name Zato from. Zato is the lowest of the blind ranks, so that's why in the Zatoichi films he's often called Zato no Ichi. His name is Ichi, meaning one of the blind ranks. So sometimes I've translated that as blind one in my own book research. But Shiranui could be a family name, and they do also find something similar to what you found, Perry. There's a line here from the DVD notes saying Shiranui literally means unknown fire, according to their translation that they found, and refers to the manifestation of the spirit of the deceased in the form of a floating fireball. It is apparently similar to orbs in modern day paranormal parlance. And then they just explain Kengo is a title given to the highest ranked blind feudal ministers who act as overseers of the blind of the nation. And as we find out in the Blind Menace, of course, we find out that they're also notorious money lenders at the time. So that's the information that I can add there about that specific question.
Okay. So, how did you first come across this movie? Because, like I said, I hadn't heard about this until you suggested it, and of course, you were able to share the link about it on archive.org, which is actually a fairly good copy. I found, like, because I watched it last night, and it's a very clean copy. It's very good resolution. Sometimes when you have these movies on archive.org, it's a mixed bag. Sometimes the quality is just absolutely terrible. But this was I was surprised at how pristine the copy actually was. But talk a little bit about your history with the Blind Menace.
Yeah, I forgot to. Thanks for mentioning that the good copy on archive.org. I forgot to double check that. I'm not sure if it exactly. It sounds like it might be better quality than the DVD I have. I do wonder if it came out on a later Blu-ray release. What I'm keeping my fingers crossed for is that labels in the UK like Arrow and Radiance in the UK have been restoring a lot of films from this era, especially from Daiei Studios. So maybe fingers crossed in future we'll get a Blu-ray restoration. But someone might have done a fan restoration of their own, who knows, with the archive.org stuff. How I came familiar with it was as I was gathering material ready to start my Zatoichi book. I can't remember if at the time when I watched the film I'd already put in my book proposal for the Zatoichi book. So this would be back around 2017, 2018, or if I watched the film maybe slightly beforehand. I think it came after I put my book proposal in. I'm going to go with that. And I'd found mention of this film a few times. I think at that time in 2018, I'd been lucky to find kind of more affordable here in the UK, a copy to pick up online for about £20. So that was interesting looking at the other day and see, oh, that's gone up in price because it's out of print and obviously harder to get hold of now. So yeah, I found the film. I'd watched, I think by that time, yes, by 2018, because I'd watched them all in when I was teaching at the University of Worcester, all of the Zatoichi films. Hadn't made my way through the spin-off TV series yet, but I'll come back to that later if we have time to discuss it. Maybe not, because there's a lot to discuss there. So I'd watched all the Zatoichi films in the University of Worcester. I'd put in one book proposal already to one publisher. They'd said no. So when it came to 2018, I tried another publisher. They ended up saying yes. Managed to get this copy of The Blind Menace, which I'd heard a few times. And the marketing on the cover also says that as well. Again, you can find this Animego DVD cover. You can find images of it on eBay if you or the listeners want to take a look at it yourself. And it has that right on the cover. The film that inspired the Zatoichi series says that this is Shintaro Katsu before he played Zatoichi. And the few short reviews I've read, I can't remember where these shorter reviews I'd come across, if they were in books about Japanese cinema, or if I just found one or two reviews online saying this is a very different portrayal of a blind man that Shintaro Katsu is putting on screen. And yeah, I would say it's kind of an odd thing to say considering the summary of the film, but I'll say this now. I was kind of pleasantly surprised by the film. This is such a different role to Zatoichi, and it really did help me see kind of the acting prowess of Shintaro Katsu, which I've become familiar with, and you do see a lot of in the Zatoichi film series. You can argue that those films are very similar, like lots of long-running westerns, either in TV series or in film series, where the lone gunslinger will come into town and, take out all the bad guys when he finds corruption is going on. That's very much the state of play in a Zatoichi film. He's very humble, tries to keep to himself, but eventually he comes across corruption, which he doesn't agree with, and ends up killing a lot of bad guys at the end of the film. That's the very formulaic structure of that. Within that, you do get Zatoichi interacting with children, interacting with wronged women, interacting with other low peasants who have faced social injustice off of the hands of the corrupt Yakuza clans that or gamblers that Zatoichi comes across. And within that, you do get to see lots of different sides of Shintaro Katsu's acting ability, but his ability to play an outright villain as well, you never see in that series because he's the hero. So this is why the Blind Menace is really, really interesting, and really interesting in this film. It's only like 90 minutes long, not a hugely long film. I do encourage people to check it out. It's kind of similar in length to what would happen later in the Zatoichi films, and there are some similar crew members as well in this film. And there's a lot packed in, even though it's 90 minutes. Just to give a brief summary, we see Suginoichi. He's got a different name early on, actually. I did make a note of that. So he starts off the film as, where is it here? Shichinosuke, later becomes Suginoichi. And we see that he's like a very conniving and scheming blind peasant from very early on in his life, to the point where he's conning noblemen out of money as a young lad, and seems to continue this through to his later life. If he does come across thieves who witness his scheming and his murderous schemes, it's not long into the film before you see him committing murder, so he can steal some money off people at the side of the road, because blind people are, at the time in medieval Japan, this is part of what the Kengyo did. They trained blind people to become masseurs because that was seen as a respectable trade for them. They're blind, they can't see, they can become masseurs, they can become skilled in acupuncture. We see very early on in this film that Suginoichi uses these skills to murder as and when he sees fit, if he sees he can make a profit out of it. If a thief witnesses him doing this, he just tries to bring them into the scheme so that they can upgrade themselves to like theft, murder. And in Suginoichi's case as well, this does happen more than once in the film. I watched the film twice over this last week, and even watching it in quick succession, I'm always I even find myself shocked, dare I say, a British phrase that we use, clutching my pearls, with the amount of times that he commits rape on screen as well. So it's theft, murder, rape. I'm sure there's something else I'm forgetting as well. Blackmail, of course, that comes into this, and all done for the reason of so he can go up the ranks of Kengyo, amass the most money possible, and become the most influential and powerful Kengyo in medieval Japan, which is slightly spoiled by the DVD cover, because we see Suginoichi on the DVD cover as he is at the end. He's finally been brought to justice and taken in by the local sheriffs or police officers at the time. So this does all come crumbling down. You could maybe compare it to many gangster tales in Hollywood films, or even Yakuza films, like the rise and falls of certain gangsters. But yeah, even though there's that comparison, it's very different to what Shintaro Katsu would become known for. Not just in the Zatoichi films, another part of my research also highlighted to me, I haven't got to see a lot of these other film series, but he would sometimes often play heroic or roguish criminal characters in other film series. So he'd be the hero of those, but he'd maybe start off these film series as kind of a hoodlum, like hoodlum soldier. He was also in the long-running Akumyo or Tough Guy series, which was about a specific Yakuza clan, and him basically beating up other Yakuza who he thought were morally unjust. So this is very different from his later heroic roles that he would often play on screen. So that's why it was fascinating to me. It's such a contrast, and again, that's one of the reasons it fascinates me. And as I said, apologies again for not having that foresight and realizing, Perry, you haven't seen any of his more heroic roles, and you've just been introduced to him as a villain. Although your reaction is probably very similar to how Shintaro Katsu got widely seen at this time. At this time in 1960, he's still making a name for himself as a star in many film roles, and maybe some people saw Shintaro Katsu for the first time on screen in a lead role in this sort of film, playing a villain, and then 2 years later they might have to get used to the fact that, oh no, he's a hero on screen, he's the blind swordsman cleaning up the town.
Yeah, it's funny. One of the ways you can look at it, if you're going to liken it to a modern day actor, you can kind of liken it to Christian Bale. Started off doing American Psycho, and then goes into a very similar type of role where he's still playing like this rich guy, but in this case he becomes Batman in that case, right? So it's very similar kind of vibes there. But also I really found myself digging this thing. Like I wouldn't say it was I think I gave it like 3 stars on Letterboxd, but I was more impressed with it than I expected to be. Sometimes with some of these older films, they can drag a little bit. The story cannot be as engaging sometimes for me, but I found this one was very engaging, pretty much all of that is due to Katsu's performance. I mean, he's got this very interesting presence. Like even though he's playing this total scumbag, this total sociopath, there's just something about his portrayal, and this is why I liken it to Christian Bale in American Psycho. It's just like you want to keep watching it. You can't look away from him. And I thought it was a really interesting performance. So I am even more curious now to check out his Zatoichi films as a result. And the other thing too is just, and this, I imagine this also came in handy when he was doing Zatoichi, but the way he portrays the mannerisms of a blind man, like the way he has his eyes closed the whole time. When he does have them open a little bit, his eyes are like rolled into the back of his head, so you can only see the whites of his eyes. It's very off-putting in a lot of ways, and I thought it was very interesting the way he executes that aspect of his performance.
Yeah. What's interesting there, and what you've noticed, is the groundwork is put in for a lot of his portrayal of Zatoichi later in the film series and also the TV series. You know, the fact that he would roll his eyes up into the back of his head, but some people would sometimes. I haven't got any documented evidence of this, but I've heard English scholars say this in hearsay when they've spoken to Japanese people about remembering watching the older Shintaro Katsu films. You know, sometimes when he opened his eyes slightly, apparently that led to a question with some Japanese viewers saying, can he actually see? Is this the secret of the Zatoichi films, that he can actually see? And the Takeshi Kitano films and many of the Shintaro Katsu films actually do clarify in many scenes that he is actually blind. You know, does some things that or makes some mistakes that only a blind man that is capable of. So it's interesting to see the groundwork for that portrayal established here. And we see scenes like, I know it's a dream sequence where he does actually have his eyes open for a few minutes, but we also see his musical skills there. And Shintaro Katsu could play both the biwa and the shamisen, the musical instruments that we see in this film, and he'd often play the shamisen throughout the Zatoichi film series. We don't hear him sing in this film. He'd do that in later Zatoichi films. Later on in the late 60s, he would actually sing the titular Zatoichi theme that would appear in a lot of the TV episodes as well as the film series. But we see his musical instruments and his skills in acting. We don't see any sword play in this film. It's not that sort of film, but it is a really interesting Japanese historical period drama nonetheless. And even though we don't see everything that he'd put on screen later as Zatoichi, the other way that this really does lay a lot of groundwork for the Zatoichi film series, it's another Daiei production. This is the studio that Katsu would often put out his work through and do work for while he was making his name as a film star and later becoming successful with the Zatoichi films, until he set up his own production company in the mid-60s, often known as Katsu Pro. Where this also lays the groundwork for the later Zatoichi films, we've got the director Kazuo Mori, who would direct a number of the Zatoichi films later. Only 3 on the list that I've checked, but some of them are often mentioned as some of the best Zatoichi films. So he did The Tale of Zatoichi Continues, which was also in 1962. The first 2 films, well, you could argue that the whole film series, they come out really quickly, especially the first 25 films. And Kazuo Mori also did The Doomed Man. We've got the writer of this film, the writer is Minoru Inuzuka, and he does adapt this book from a novel by Nobuo Uno, and I couldn't find a lot about the original novel, but we've got Minoru Inuzuka adapting it, which is hugely significant because he would become the main writer for the Zatoichi series. He wouldn't write every single one, but he wrote the first 3, and then the 5th and 7th entries, and then the 10th, and he'd come back for the 24th entry as well. So he kept coming in and out of the series. So he's really associated with the popularity of that early on. And the assistant director is also interesting, who I always forget is credited right at the beginning of this film. The DVD that I've got is great. It translates all the credits as well. And I noticed another familiar name in there, Akira Inoue, who would go on to direct Zatoichi's Revenge, which is the 10th film in the series, and a lot of the Zatoichi TV episodes. So yeah, it's really interesting that both behind the scenes and on the screen, we get a lot of groundwork being laid here, and it also highlights to me this film must have been hugely successful to allow Katsu to go on to portray the blind swordsman in a couple of years. And they just brought with them a lot of things that worked here. I mean, yes, Kenji Mizumi directs the first film. He's a fantastic Japanese film director in his own right, often associated with the Zatoichi films and the Lone Wolf and Cub films, but made so many other great Jidaigeki Japanese period films, Shambara films, they're sometimes also called, the ones he made, sword play or sword action films. So he'd direct the first, but as I said, the credits behind this film just show that show the filmmaking talent they had at the Daiei studio that following the success of this film, they were willing to Daiei were willing to continue to add and bring to the Zatoichi film series. So it's hugely significant for that reason, what's going on behind the scenes as well as on the screen.
Yeah, well, I tend to focus more on what's going on in front of the screen myself, and when I was looking through this, and but just one of the things that also kind of struck me about his performance was just how quickly he switches on a dime from like the mask of like the humble, kind masseur to then just being this, total outright scumbag. Like one of those scenes that it's very off-putting in general, but especially the scene when he is with the wife and he's giving her a massage, and he's just like, it's like as he's giving her the massage, he just very, nonchalantly moves his hand over to one of her breasts, and she tries to take it off, and then he just pushes forward, and next thing you know, he just completely rapes her. But then insult to injury, the next day, he's convinced her to let him stay the night, and the next day her husband comes home, and he's talking about how he's like, oh well, I had the honor of servicing your wife instead, and all this under the guise of like a masseur. And this nobleman is like, oh, well, that's so great. And I'm so glad you were able to, come here and have a good night and everything. And then he just says, he's like, oh, by the way, ma'am, can I have the money back that I gave you to watch over? And this is the money that he ostensibly loaned her to help her brother, because her brother's in debt and she needed to find a way to help pay off his debts without letting her husband know. And Suginoichi was going to give her this money, and then ostensibly as payment for him raping her. But then he gets the money back, and he asks her in front of the husband for it. And so she has no choice but to give it back without arising suspicion as to, well, why did he give you the money then if you're not going to give it back? And then later she says to him, she's like, well, I still need that money. He's like, oh, well, it's okay. Come by my place later then. And I guess I'll see you at my place later. And she does. And then he rapes her again. And then he gives her, it was supposed to be 50, but he gives her only 5. And she's like, but I need the 50. I thought it was 50. And he's like, oh, no, I'm not giving it all at once. You're going to have to come back here each time. And he's keeping records of all their encounters. Meanwhile, her husband is getting suspicious about where she's going. And it's just like the guile that he displays on here. And it just in such a cool, matter-of-fact manner, and almost like in a friendly manner. It's very like it's that old saying about the banality of evil. I feel like that was really running through my head as I was watching him throughout this movie.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, it shows his acting skills, how he's able to switch that. And yeah, it's one of the most, I agree, it's one of the most sinister moments of that film when it happens. Funny piece of trivia there, though. The actress playing Lady EY, one of the many women that you can guess. I mean, we don't see loads of women that Suginoichi sexually exploits in this film, but it's strongly implied, he's doing this more than once, probably.
With the ease at which he does it, and also with the ease at which he murders using acupuncture needles, you get the feeling that this is not something that he is a new hand at. This is something that he's gotten a lot of experience doing.
Yeah, indeed. But a funny piece of trivia there with the actress playing Lady EY, that is Shintaro Katsu's future wife. I'm just going to make sure I don't butcher the name with the pronoun. Sorry, it is Tamao Nakamura playing Lady EY. And I think it was shortly after the making this film, despite what happens on screen in terms of the plot, obviously they're doing their jobs as actors, but they would marry shortly afterwards and remain married up until Shintaro Katsu's death in 1997. I don't think she's passed away since. She might still be living in Japan. I'm not sure if she's still acting. But yeah, it's another interesting piece of trivia there, and a hell of a contrast, of course, compared to what happens to her on screen.
So, on the part about Tamao Nakamura, it looks like she is still alive, and it looks like she is still active. As of 2023, she was in Ichiban Atai Hito, which looks like it might have been some sort of maybe some dramatic film or something like that. I don't know a lot about it, but yeah, it's a drama film. But that's the most recent thing she's been in. Also, she's mentioned on some episodes of a TV show, Zoku Zoku Jiken, but this doesn't have a date on it. Oh, no, it says 1980. Never mind. Just looking here on the movie database. So yeah, it looks like she is still alive. It looks like as of at least a few years ago, she is still doing some acting as well.
Yeah, the last time I saw her on screen, technically it wasn't on screen, but it was a recording of a stage play. In 2009, there was a stage version of a Zatoichi story. I think it was original to that stage play, the story that they portrayed. It's put on stage. Tamao Nakamura made an appearance, as well as Ryotaro Gan, one of Shintaro Katsu's children. So they had supporting roles in this stage play where Zatoichi was portrayed by Ken Matsudaira, who was an actor who was mentored by Shintaro Katsu in the early part of his career. And he would go on to have a very successful TV career, appearing in several, more than one. I can't remember how many it was, but he was definitely in more than one very long-running Japanese period dramas, Ken Matsudaira. And it's interesting to mention a Zatoichi stage play there, because I think just the year afterwards, in 2010, or it was just before. I think it was just before, actually, because I think this stage play was made by Ken Matsudaira because he wasn't impressed with, sadly, what Takashi Miike did. But just before this, Takashi Miike had done his own stage version of Zatoichi with Sho Aikawa playing Zatoichi. You can also find digital recordings of that online, and some websites like Yes Asia and some other websites that sell imported DVDs sell sometimes DVDs of the Ken Matsudaira version and the Sho Aikawa version.
Yeah, one of the things I thought was interesting too with this was just the influence of the opening scene when he's a kid, because we see him and we get it. So he comes from this poor background, but one of the interesting things is, and this is probably the only act of kindness which we see, which is still an act of duplicity, is right in the first scene. There's a festival going on, and all the men who are active in the festival, and they're drinking sake, and it's apparently it's very high quality sake. And what he does is he wanders over to the sake barrel, and he picks his nose and he throws it in there, and he tells them, he's like, "Oh, you can't drink that, my snot got in it." And then he's able to get them to give him the sake bucket and take it home. So he takes it home to his mom, who apparently loves this kind of sake, and she says about how she hasn't been able to have this kind of good alcohol in a while. And then we meet and there's also, when we first see his mother, she is in an argument with one of the neighbors, talking about, and the neighbor's like accusing her of being a battle axe, and like being, very cruel to her husband, who's, apparently a very nice guy. And then we see the husband come in, and he is, by all accounts, he does seem to be like, this kind of person who's like, well, we may be poor, but we don't steal. We're going to do the right thing. We're going to make our way the right way. Whereas his mother is very much concerned about money, and she's very concerned about the fact, like, well, if only we can get our son into training program, he could become a masseur and all this kind of stuff. So there's it feels like his mother and his father, in indirect ways, and his father, they both influence the kind of man he would become. Where in the case of his mother, it's this idea of like, money is the most important thing. You do whatever you have to get the money. And she never asked him about how he got the sake. She's like, "Oh, great, you brought sake home." Whereas his father does ask. He's like, "Don't tell me you didn't steal it." And he's like, "No, I didn't steal it." But the fact that his father is kind of like this henpecked man, and he's very kind of beaten down by his wife, and he's trying to do the right thing, and he's not getting anywhere that way. Plus his mother's idea of like just get what you can however you can. It feels like that really kind of influences the kind of man he becomes, where he decides like, okay, well, I'm going to exploit my disability however I can to get close to people and to take what I want from them. And I'm going to basically screw them over before they screw me over. And even to the point with his partners in crime, like this, Kurakichi, right? Who sees him killing this passerby on the road. And then he convinces him to join him in his scams. But one of the things he tells him is he's like, well, give me some sort of marker or something, so when I go to your office I have something to show them. And it's this thing that it doesn't, and then he puts it in the hand of the dead man, and then it's gone. And every now and then Kurakichi asks him about it. It's like, what happened to that amulet? He's like, oh, I left it somewhere. I'm sorry, I forgot to bring it. I'll bring it next time. And he keeps delaying it and pushing it back. And you can see that I was kind of surprised to see him interacting with Kurakichi, because my impression was like right away Kurakichi was going to be blamed for this guy's death. But it's not until years later, after Suganoichi has risen to Kengyo and Kurakichi is thinking about finding a way to get rid of him, that's when it comes back to bite him in the ass, and he ends up getting arrested for that crime of murder, which he didn't commit, although definitely enabled in some way. So I thought all of that was really interesting, how he kind of exploits the society's view of him at the time. And also because at this time, right, this is feudal Japan. So there aren't a lot of opportunities to rise above your rank in society, right? It's whatever you were born in, that was your rank. That was the whole idea of feudalism. So, and in some ways you can kind of understand I'm not saying sympathize, because he's definitely not a sympathetic character, but you can understand how one would develop that kind of mentality, where if society's not going to give me opportunities to rise above my station, then I'm just going to take what I can, because who cares about being honorable in a society where it's not going to get you anything.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in some ways there's a parallel ethos found in Shintaro Katsu's later portrayal of Zatoichi, or how the character is portrayed and characterized in those later films, because he sometimes lets slip bits of dialogue, bits of background about his life and why he trained to use a sword when he's playing Zatoichi, saying he was tired of being looked down on, so he decided to train himself with a sword so he could fight back. But you find out in so many of those films, he's very reluctant to pull out his sword, and he'll only do it if he's particularly been wronged, or if other people around him are being wronged, usually people of the peasant class who are being exploited by the Yakuza and the gangsters. So yeah, if anyone listening to this, or any fans of Japanese cinema, come to the Blind Menace later after seeing the Zatoichi films, it's interesting watching this film, suggesting this is a route that someone like Zatoichi could have gone down, rather than becoming the honorable hero. This is the alternative route. And that does remind me, in some of the later films, particularly in the TV series, I think this happens more than once, there are blind antagonists that come up that Zatoichi has to either better, like get people to capture them, or outright kill himself, where they are blind people that have gone down the wrong path, maybe similar to Sugi Noichi rather than Zatoichi. So yeah, it is really interesting how that is portrayed, because it is believable in this film as well. If you're that downtrodden, you come from that deprived a background, you kind of, again, sympathy is probably the wrong word to use, as you said, Perry, but you do understand how a character has gone down that path if they're just sick of their deprived background and want to better themselves. They could easily think, well, the way I'm going to do this is to exploit this as best as I can and rise up the ranks as quickly and as corruptly as I can.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're getting close to about been talking about this for a while now. And is there any other things that kind of really jumped out at you that you wanted to mention that we haven't talked about so far?
Just trying to think. I think we've talked a lot about his conniving and despicability, which reminds me of, there's another great thing about this DVD release. I mean, if you can't get a copy of it, I completely understand as it's out of print, but I just wanted to mention, because I do have a copy, it's one of the interesting things about this DVD release. If it is restored and put on Blu-ray anytime soon, I don't think the BBFC or any ratings board are going to rate it an 18, but for some reason Animego put a suggested rating of 18 plus on it. And the warning that they gave the back of this film on the DVD box is, warning contains violence and despicability, which I think we can agree is an overriding characteristic of this film. If anyone is interested to see it, I would also say that the DVD release is interesting. It highlights the English language title, The Blind Menace, and Agent Shiranui, which is the title that you mentioned earlier, Perry. That seems to be the original Japanese title. It does also mention here, sometimes you find this film titled as Shiranui Kengyo, or Secrets of a Court Masseur. So it's one of those interesting films with various different titles that people might find if they're interested in it. So if you come across one of the alternative titles by accident, don't worry, you're still watching the same film.
Yeah, that happens sometimes with some of these older films, especially ones that aren't as well known. They sometimes have gotten multiple titles in different English releases over the years I've seen.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah, it is a really interesting film. Like, it's not the greatest film, but it is very fascinating to watch, and he is very. There's definitely parts that are, disturbing to watch, not disturbing as in, gory or overly graphic, but just like the situation is very disconcerting in it a lot of times, especially because they do also have a lot of scenes showing the aftermath of his crimes against the women. So you see many scenes of his victims laying on the tatami crying afterwards, where he's just sitting in the next room, just calmly, nonchalantly, like smoking or drinking tea or whatever. And which adds another layer of vileness to his character. And it's just, yeah, especially if you are familiar with Katsu's work as Zatoichi, I think it would probably definitely be a shock to your system, because that seems to be the thing that I see mentioned most often in every single review I've read about this, is people drawing the comparisons between Katsu's performance as Zatoichi and his performance as Suganoichi.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a really interesting thing to highlight. Again, we might be repeating points other people have mentioned, but I just want to also say it's one of the interesting aspects I found writing the book on the history of the Zatoichi films. Obviously, so much of that was dedicated to Shintaro Katsu and what he brought to the role in terms of his acting, and later becoming the production company basis for most of these films in terms of the film series and later the TV series. Yeah, it's so interesting to see that contrast, because sorry, that's the point I wanted to say. When I did the research for that book, that also opened up to me. I've still not watched a lot of the other films that he made. I've watched this and a few others, and that really opened my eyes to the fact that he's arguably most famous in the West for playing Zatoichi the Blind Swordsman. But if you go down that road of exploring just his filmography and what I did, the context of the wider Zatoichi films, you find that, wow, he was doing a lot more roles, and this is one of the interesting ones that you can now find online. As I said, I'll keep my fingers crossed for a Blu-ray release and restoration in future, but it's definitely an interesting one to look at if you, as you say, you only know his work from the Zatoichi films. This and other titles that he did really can open a viewer's eyes to show what other films Shintaro Katsu was doing, and what he could bring to other roles outside of the very famous Blind Swordsman, which is nothing wrong with watching those films as well. I still love them to this day.
Yeah. All right. Well, again, interesting film. And as we had mentioned before, if you wanted to find it, it's freely available on archive.org. In fact, just searching for The Blind Menace turned up a bunch of links to other videos, other places where it's available. So it's very easy to find for free. So you can definitely find it in those aspects. But Jonathan, thank you so much for coming on. I was glad to finally have you on and to meet you in person after we've been playing email tag for quite some time now, actually.
Yeah.
But before we finish up, why don't you tell people about what you got coming up? Anything else you'd like to promote?
Well, there is, of course, the Zatoichi book that's still out there now, available from the Bloomsbury website, not the Roman Littlefield website, as well as from other retailers. It is quite expensive, but if anyone wants to discuss some of the knowledge that I have in that book, some of the Zatoichi trivia, some of the history that I found, my email address is also always available. I am on Blue Sky. I am also still on Twitter, which I know is a controversial platform these days, but I do find with my research on Japanese cinema, a lot of Japanese film news is still reported on there. So that's one of the main reasons I'm still there, as well as a lot of promotion of DVD and Blu-ray releases, particularly of Japanese films and other film genres that I'm interested in. So most recently, I've been trying to get some research projects off the ground following the Zatoichi book. It's taken me a little bit of time, mainly because of teaching work and other commitments. One thing I have done in recent years here at the University of Greenwich, luckily I was told by the librarians there was a space for me to start this project, which we're now hopefully the archiving and databasing stage of, where I've managed to, over the last year, through some funding kindly given to me from the University of Greenwich, we have an archive of Neo magazine, which Perry and lots of listeners may not have heard of, but here in the UK, from 2004 to 2024, when they sadly had to stop publishing because it was too expensive to keep the magazine going. They stopped publishing after 20 years. They published a total of 245 issues. We had to buy a lot of the issues secondhand from sites like eBay mostly, but also got a few from other sources. But we now have a full collection. We're going to try and archive and database that as a record of what this magazine brought to the UK in terms of reporting on Japanese film, popular culture, as well as anime and manga. I must be honest, a few years ago, this was back around 2017, 2018, again, I contributed a few live action film reviews to that magazine, not for a huge length of time, but I did it for a couple of years. So I'm one of the magazine's many contributors, but lots of others did it for a longer period of time. I hope to interview them in future about the work of the magazine, but mainly the archive project is about establishing what that brought to the UK and the view of Japanese popular culture that it brought to the UK. One of this isn't necessarily a negative flip side of this. One of the ways that kind of project has been sidetracked, as I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast recording, is that over this last year, I've very kindly, out of the blue, been asked to contribute some essays to some DVD and Blu-ray releases of forthcoming films that are getting restored. I think it's mostly Blu-ray now, other than DVD. So for forthcoming Blu-ray restorations, I've as I said, contributed some essays. That now does include Zebra Man 2. I often like promoting Zebra Man 1 and 2 because they both came from 88 films, but my essays particularly for Zebra Man 2, so those are well worth picking up if you're a UK listener and a fan of Japanese films, or if I know there are many collectors around the world. Some people like to import some of the UK releases. I've got essays coming out in this next year or so, I believe, for Blu-ray releases coming up of Yo-Yo Go Cop from 2006, and I've just finished one for the Japanese horror action film X-Cross from 2007. Those are getting re-released on Blu-ray soon. They're both by Kenta Fukasaku. And as just last month, we're recording this in December 2025. In November 2025, I got asked again out of the blue. It's a very pleasant surprise, though, to record some audio commentaries for some Japanese films. So I can now confirm, this is also confirmed on the Eureka Entertainment website, at the end of January, there's a double box set of Kiyoshi Kurosawa films coming out. Charisma from 1999 will be included in that set, and Cloud from 2024. So both really interesting films. Eureka wanted to release both those films together, and I was lucky enough to record a commentary for both films. And then in February, Eureka are also bringing out a 5-film box set of the Miyamoto Musashi film series that was released in the 1960s, where Kinosuke Nakamura plays the titular Miyamoto Musashi. Unfortunately, I didn't have the time available to record a commentary for all 5 films, but I've done the commentary for the first film, and there's lots of other booklets and video essays being put together for that set. So I'll be in that as well, and that'll be coming out in February 2026. And I'll stop all my plugs there, but that's what I've got going in the meantime just for now, Perry. Thank you again for having me on.
No, thank you for coming on. And if people keep an eye out for that stuff. By the time this episode comes out, some of that stuff may already be available. So go ahead and take a look at that stuff. We'll have links to some of the links in the show notes. So please make sure to check out that. As for us, JapanOnFilm.com is the website. We are JapanOnFilm.com on Blue Sky, Japan on Film on Instagram, Threads, anywhere else. Although Blue Sky is where you can mostly find us these days. And the link, there's also a link to the Discord, so you can join the Film Stories Discord. We've got a dedicated channel for Japan on Film, and we are part of the Film Stories podcast network. So please listen up to hear what is coming up next on the network. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
The Japan on Film podcast is produced by me, Perry Constantine, in conjunction with the Film Stories Podcast Network. Visit JapanOnFilm.com for show notes, episodes, and information about being a guest yourself. You can also reach out to me on the website's contact form if you have questions or comments about Japanese movies or the show itself. The show is at Japan on Film on Threads, Blue Sky, and Instagram, so please be sure to follow us. If you'd like to support the show, you can donate on JapanOnFilm.com, purchase from our advertisers, or leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Join the Film Stories Podcast Network Discord from the link in the show notes to connect with me and many other cinema fans and podcasters.